Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, we're going to dive back into the channel History Matters today. This is only a 3-minute video, but you know me. We're talking about something related to the American Civil War, so I will have plenty to say. And my understanding from having done some History Matters videos in the past is that they cram a lot into those 3 minutes. So just warning you up front, expect frequent pauses and frequent long elaborations. I will not be surprised if this 3-minute video turns into a 15-minute reaction. So I'll put the link down in the description so you can check it out, as well as check out all of the other content on History Matters channel. If you like really bite-sized pieces of history to start your day and just want something real quick, they do that, but they still manage to pack a lot into those things. So join with me as we dive into this one. This is Why Weren't Confederate Leaders Punished After the Civil War? Should be an interesting topic for discussion. So before we even start, it looks like we've got Henry VIII, and I guess that could be Thomas Cromwell. It could be Thomas More, because they both kind of had that look about them, both executed on orders of Henry VIII. So interesting.
Usually, treason is met with a pretty harsh response. But after the American Civil War, none of the leaders of the breakaway Confederacy were tried, convicted, or punished for treason.
Now, I will say this. He says usually treason is punished with a harsh response, and that's generally true, but you can see plenty of examples, especially in, for example, the Wars of the Roses in Britain during the 1400s. You see these bloody wars, and I mean, like Towton's one of the, Towton, I think, is arguably the bloodiest battle ever fought on British soil, and that was a civil war. That was a war between sides that were in the same country, and in many of the times in the aftermath of the Wars of the Roses, and we call it wars plural because it broke out different times, and there were different people on different sides at different times, so it wasn't just one long war between two sides. But very often you would see examples of the person who came out on top saying, you know what, we're going to show some forgiveness and reconciliation. We can't just execute everybody every single time after these battles. There'll be nobody left. And so in exchange for loyalty, they would sometimes offer pardon. But then if there was a repeat and it happened again, then it would be much harsher.
Which raises the obvious question. Why not? Why weren't the leaders of the Confederate States punished? Well, the decision to not punish Southern leaders was made by President Lincoln in early 1865. He met with military leaders, and after it was obvious that the war was going to be won quickly, Lincoln made it clear that he didn't want Confederate leaders punished.
So much like during the Second World War, where we get to the point in the Second World War, especially in later 1944 and early 1945, where it's pretty clear that the Allies are going to win. And so they're already having meetings at places like Potsdam, which is after the war has ended in Europe, where they're planning the post-war world. And a lot of that is happening with Lincoln and especially the Republican leadership as they get into the fall of 64, early 65, when it's pretty clear that the North's going to win the war. And they're thinking ahead to, now how do we deal with the peace? How do we deal with the former Confederate states? How do we deal with the former Confederate leaders? How do we reshape the South in light of emancipation and the 13th Amendment, which frees the slaves? And they're thinking about all of this, and Lincoln's policy is basically let them up easy. And Grant follows suit with that. When Lee surrenders at Appomattox, short time after, Grant hears gunfire going off, cannons being fired in celebration. And Grant sends messages to tell them to stop. And he says the Confederates are our countrymen again, or the rebels. They didn't often call them Confederates because they didn't recognize the legitimacy of the Confederate government. But he said the rebels are our countrymen again. There was that instant recognition, at least by the people at the top, that we're all Americans. We never all stopped being Americans. They were rebels, but now the rebellion has ended, and now we need to figure out a way to move forward.
He believed that the coming years would be fraught with the risk of reigniting the war.
He was right.
And thus he wanted to focus on reconciliation and not retribution. His generals went along with this because he was the boss.
Sherman and Grant went along with it because he was the boss. Yeah, but I think that kind of fits, at least with Grant. with the attitude that Grant would have had. Sherman might have felt a little differently about it, which is interesting because Sherman actually lived in the South right before the war broke out. He was the president of what is today Louisiana State University. And it was said that when he knew that the war was coming, that when he first got word of secession, that he went into another room and wept, and for a good bit of the day was just inconsolable because he knew instantly how bloody the war was going to be. And he hated to see that happen to the South because there were a lot of people that he really loved in the South.
Until he very suddenly wasn't, that is. After Lincoln had been moved, his successor, Andrew Johnson, wanted the South reincorporated into the Union quickly.
Well, why did Andrew Johnson want that? Well, he was a Southerner. Andrew Johnson was a senator from Tennessee. He was a Democrat, one of the few Democrats who, really the only Southern Democrat who remained loyal to the Union out of these prominent politicians. He becomes the war governor of Tennessee, Eastern Tennessee, which is where Johnson is from. He's from around Greenville. Actually was very pro-Union even during the war. But Johnson was a Democrat. He was also pro-slavery and a flaming racist, just like most people were at that time. I shouldn't say most, but a lot of people. But he was put on the ticket because Lincoln was, again, thinking about reconciliation. And what better way to communicate to the South the idea of wanting to heal the nation than to put a Southern Democrat on your ticket with you as a Republican. Of course, it backfired because Lincoln got assassinated, and Johnson wants to kind of move things along. But Johnson, he's kind of a weird cat when it comes to this stuff, because on one hand, like, he didn't really want to push forward a lot of the progressive ideas on freedom and citizenship for the freedmen. But he also was willing to crack down pretty hard on some of the Confederate leaders, but then he also issued a blanket pardon to all of them. So he's kind of a weird dichotomy there.
The problem he faced was that many in the North, particularly politicians in the Republican Party, wanted justice to be done.
So that's clearly Edwin Stanton right there, who himself was a Democrat before the war. He's from Northeast Ohio. He's from Steubenville and been a Democrat until the war broke out. Lincoln was a moderate. And the parties had wings. They had conservatives, they had moderates, they had liberals, and Lincoln was a moderate Republican, and he had to deal with the radical Republicans and the conservative Republicans. The radicals were the more liberal Republicans, the ones who wanted emancipation right away, who wanted to abolish slavery even before the war broke out, who wanted to give citizenship and land, and just were on that kind of far end of how to deal with the South, punish the South severely. But then you had the more conservative ones who didn't want to do all that, and Lincoln was somewhere in the middle. But now his moderate voice is gone.
Now, obviously, it wasn't viable to imprison or hang everyone who had fought for the Confederacy, and so their anger was focused on the political and military leaders at the top. Jefferson Davis was arrested shortly after the war's conclusion, and there were many in the North that wanted to see him punished for all the lives lost.
Yeah, and one of the earliest memories that future President Woodrow Wilson has growing up in the South is seeing Jefferson Davis and his entourage ride through town as they were fleeing after Richmond fell. Davis ends up being captured, I think, in Georgia in May of 1865. There were people saying he was dressed as a woman, but he was just trying to keep warm, and he had a shawl on that was woman's. He wasn't hiding and trying to pretend to be a woman or anything like that. But yeah, people wanted to see Jefferson Davis hanged.
Johnson actually wanted this trial to go ahead, but importantly so did Jefferson Davis, which is why it never happened. You see, Davis was keen on being taken to trial because it was all but impossible to convict him of any wrongdoing. You see, the idea of the United States being one nation, indivisible, wasn't a thing in 1865.
But it was. It wasn't to everybody, and I understand what he's getting at, that there was a different notion of the states. But it was always disagreed upon. There were always those, especially in the South, who saw it more as a confederation with preferably a weak federal government and the states being strong. But in the North, it was much more viewed as one nation with the federal government being strong. And that's a debate that goes all the way back to the time of the Constitution. So, yeah, there were plenty of people. And the whole reason that Abraham Lincoln was willing to go to war in the first place, and after Fort Sumter was fired on by the South, he calls for troops to be raised to put down the rebellion, is that he did view the country as one nation, indivisible. And that's why hundreds of thousands of men signed up to fight for the Union in 1861 and 62, to preserve the Union, because they did see it that way.
The other issue which made punishing Davis incredibly difficult was Article 3 of the Constitution. If Davis were ever to stand
Wait, let's read that real quick.
Which made punishing Davis incredibly difficult was Article 3 of the Constitution.
People get tried in their own states, yo. Even people who break up the country and plunge it into a 4-year civil war. What does it actually say? Okay, so I think this is the part he's referring to in Article 3, Section 2, Clause 1, but Clause 3 actually says, the trial of all crimes, except in cases of impeachment, shall be by jury, and such trial shall be held in the state where the said crime shall have been committed. But when not committed within any state, the trial should be at such place or places as the Congress may by law have directed. So I'm not sure this applies to Jefferson Davis. Can you really say there's a particular state where he committed his crimes? And the reason I say, can you say there's a particular state? Because even if you go on, well, the Confederate capital was in Richmond, Virginia. Well, it was eventually, but it started out in Montgomery, Alabama, which is where Jefferson Davis, who was from Mississippi, was sworn in, was in Montgomery, Alabama. There's actually a photo of Jefferson Davis being sworn in Montgomery. So even from that standpoint, the crimes committed were in multiple states.
If Davis were ever to stand trial, it would have to take place in his home state of Virginia, where...
Wait a second. Jefferson Davis was not from Virginia. That's where he lived during the Civil War because that's where the capital was. But, we don't say that Abraham Lincoln was from the District of Columbia. He was born in Kentucky and lived briefly in Indiana and grew up in Illinois and spent most of his life there. We say he's from Illinois. Jefferson Davis is from Mississippi. The Davises were massive land and slave owners in the area not far from Vicksburg, Mississippi.
He would be tried by his fellow Virginians, the overwhelming majority of whom would have supported the Confederacy, so good luck with that. The same issue applied to the...
And again, I don't know that I agree with that, though, because let's look at the trial of... the trials that did take place afterwards. First of all, you have the trial of the conspirators in the Lincoln assassination. That was a military tribunal that was held in Virginia, I think, and they were executed by the federal government. There were 2 Confederate soldiers who were executed, and those were both done by military tribunals. One was the commandant of Andersonville Prison, Henry Wirtz, and the other one was, off the top of my head, I can't remember his name, but he was a guy who was responsible for the Saltville Massacre, for example, which was a massacre of black soldiers that had been wounded in the Saltville raid and were being held in a hospital there. So there were executions that took place, and there was no trouble with those trials because they were done by military tribunals, which Edwin Stanton oversaw.
The rest of the Confederate political leadership. They were simply never going to be found guilty by people who agreed with their actions.
I disagree.
And hated those pushing for their imprisonment.
Because I guarantee you, if the Union wanted to put them on trial, they would have put them on trial in such a way that there was a distinct possibility of their guilt being found.
And no trial at all was seen as much better than trying to prosecute them and then being found innocent. In terms of punishing the heads of the Confederate military, everybody knew that the likes of Robert E. Lee were completely untouchable too. He and his peers held incredible loyalty from former serving soldiers. And also, Lee was a major proponent of reconciliation from both sides.
So you got Frederick Douglass there on the right. I do like how the animation style is, it's generic enough that there's kind of a common thread with all of them, but it's unique enough that you can recognize some of the key players in all this.
As such, he had a lot of value, and punishing him and those like him would only make things a lot worse, because the mood in the US after the Civil War was extremely tense.
I will give him that. I think that's probably true. I think that there was definitely a line of reasoning that said that it was better to keep guys like Robert E. Lee alive and let them go free rather than punish them. And they did do some things afterwards, and maybe he'll get to this, where initially they banned former Confederates, especially the higher-ups, from public office. But then eventually Johnson issues a blanket pardon to most of these guys, and a lot of them return to the government. A lot of them end up being elected to Congress, end up serving as governors in states.
Reintegrating the South was going to be hard enough. And so, adding half a decade of military and civil trials was only going to risk reigniting violence, and after such a bloody civil war, no American was willing to countenance that.
And yet there was a ton of violence in the South. And we do, I did a couple of videos on Reconstruction years ago, and I'd like to revisit that topic at some point and do it in a much better way. it's a bloody, it's a nasty time, especially in places like Mississippi and Louisiana, but in other parts of the South as well. You have the rise of the Klan, which Grant basically destroys when he's president. But by the time you get into the 1870s, Americans are sick of the violence. They're sick of dealing with the aftermath of the Civil War, and they kind of turn their back on Reconstruction.
Which is why things like the push for increasing the rights of freedmen was delayed and eventually abandoned.
Also, I've pardoned their leaders, it said.
It's all about keeping the nation together, no matter the cost. I hope you enjoyed this episode.
Okay, yeah, so I mean, obviously that was actually only 2 minutes and 27 seconds, so there's a lot more to this topic, and like everything else in history, it's complicated, and there's nuance, and there's so much we could look at, but the bottom line is that yes, the moderates like Abraham Lincoln wanted to see reconciliation. So did the conservatives. The more radical Republicans didn't see it that way. And that's why you end up seeing Andrew Johnson being impeached and nearly removed from office, was because the radical Republicans were adamantly opposed to Andrew Johnson's policies on the South. And so they looked for an avenue to get rid of him because they never wanted him in the first place to be president. And so they passed this bill, the Tenure of Office Act, which meant that the president didn't have the right to remove his own cabinet officials because he was having trouble with guys in the cabinet, especially Edwin Stanton, of all people. And Stanton was actually suspended from the job. And for a while, Grant, who was the general-in-chief of the Army, was also serving as the temporary Secretary of War while this whole thing was being played out. And eventually he fires him. And the Congress then says, you can't do that. We passed a bill that says you can't do that. Well, that eventually was thrown out as being unconstitutional because the president needs to be able to have control over his own cabinet. But he still went on trial, was impeached, or he was impeached, he went on trial, was found not guilty by a single vote in the Senate from being impeached. And that all happened because of this fight over how to deal with the South. And how to deal with the aftermath of the Civil War. So it's a deep topic with a lot to talk about. Let me know your thoughts. Is there another video from History Matters you'd like me to check out and break down? Is there another video on this whole topic of the aftermath of the war that you think would be interesting to check out? Let me know in the comment section below. Thanks for watching.